So welcome everyone once again to the Ideamarket podcast. I'm joined by Michael Ice, CEO of Ideamarket, and we are joined by Bill Ottman, CEO and co-founder of Minds.com. For those of you that don't know what Minds.com is, it is a social media alternative for those people who don't want to be deplatformed, don't want to be silenced, and it's pretty casual about this in comparison to other platforms, I'd say. So instead of sort of the usual question of just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself, we have a question for you, Bill, which is if you were to develop a bootcamp course and the whole point of the bootcamp is for those who take it to basically become clones of yourself, what would that bootcamp look like?
All right. Hey, guys. Okay, let's design a curriculum on the spot. I would say, well, for crypto, there's my favorite explainer resource is Finematics, which I recommend to everybody. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He does these amazing tutorials on DeFi and crypto. But, for what I'm knowledgeable about, it's really just like the philosophy of open source and why that is so essential to the future of all networks and all applications, all protocols. Really, if it's not open source, it's not an alternative. And there's just these core principles: transparency, privacy, user ownership, that we try to think about when we're building anything. And so, you mentioned the free speech stuff in the beginning. I think that that's like a component of it, but it's really sort of just, it's an important foundational component of what we care about, but it's not the totality of what we care about. It's really just about digital rights, internet freedom in general. And, if you search any of these terms, you'll start to go down the rabbit hole of why encryption matters, why, how kind of cryptography evolved from, communications to cryptocurrency. And, so it's kind of go down the list, but it's really all about internet freedom to me. And, there's a lot to learn and unpack there. So I'll stop there.
Well, go ahead, James.
I was going to say, do you think it's sort of ironic that you had to say internet freedom? Do you I think many of us probably understand the internet was meant to be complete freedom, right? And we almost had that for a while early on in the early days. The fact there's a whole idea of freedom on the internet is a bit of a punch to the gut, right?
People say that a lot, that like Web 1 was decentralized. And I think that there definitely were parts of it that were, more people were like running an email server and whatnot. But, when I was using Web 1, I don't think that like Ask Jeeves and like Netscape and Angel Fire, all of these kind of old school sites were, they didn't care about freedom really. They didn't talk about it. There were definitely like cypherpunk forums where people were talking about this kind of stuff, but like AOL and, that was pretty corporate. So, I think that we have kind of gone full circle, but it is an entirely new thing, I think, with Web3.
Would you say that Web 1 didn't talk so much about freedom because it was kind of the default, like a sort of Garden of Eden before the descent into the possibility of unfreedom?
To be honest, I haven't really researched it enough. I know that, the very idea of free and open source software is relatively new. Like if you listen to any of Richard Stallman's talks or, other kind of software freedom advocates, originally software just was free. People, this whole idea of software patents like wasn't even considered. And then Windows came in and Mac and Apple, and they started, keeping source code secret, even though a lot of the times they were building on top of open source and exploiting it. themselves. So to be honest, I don't know. I mean, even just like Git wasn't nearly as, it wasn't even a thing. So I think that like version control was completely different back then. And like, I honestly don't know enough about it, but I think that you're probably right. There probably was some more freedom just naturally, but also I think that there were probably also a lot of corners that were cut by certain companies. So I don't know enough about it actually.
Cool. Well, like a lot of people, had their formative software years in Web 1, but were not so drawn to these principles as you. I'm wondering what kinds of experiences you had or viewpoints you had that really clarified the set of priorities that ended up setting the foundation for Minds.
I mean, I just didn't even know that it was a thing, like that there was sort of this schism between, sites and apps that care about your freedom and sites that don't. So as soon as I realized that there were, and that places like Mozilla and Wikipedia and Linux and, Tor and all of these really important open source projects, like once I realized that those existed and that, hey, I could use, Firefox as opposed to Safari, like people don't know that that's even a choice that matters in any way. They just get their computer and they just use the browser that's on it. So, and I used to be super, and still am, into like, local organic food, and I care about where things that I use come from and like how they affect the world. So, I totally love the philosophy of voting with your dollars. I mean, that is how the world changes, by, where people put their energy. So the fact that I could now apply that to my usage of the internet, that was like a huge breakthrough for me. Yeah.
It sounds kind of like, I love the lifeboat metaphor that goes into Bitcoin, where, there's this legacy financial system that everyone is sick of, and the way out of it is, build this alternative that people can escape to. It seems like Minds has kind of taken a very similar approach. Has that been deliberate?
I think that we knew from the beginning that, transparency was inevitable. Like, 'cause if you just look at the examples of the initial open source systems that just took over the market, Linux, Wikipedia, Firefox is struggling a little bit now, but, I think that we've seen in that, Bitcoin starting to take over financial markets. It's like, this is a pattern. And so absolutely early on, I saw that there was no major social network that was open source. And that to me was just a gaping hole that needed to be filled. So, and it was obvious to me instinctually that all systems will eventually gravitate towards being open source. And I think that what happened more so with Bitcoin and Ethereum and crypto is that, not only will they be open source, but they'll be more peer-to-peer and decentralized. That wasn't as much of a thing like 10 years ago. We definitely still had people talking about that, and you had torrents, and you had, different peer-to-peer systems that like changed the internet in certain ways. But I think that crypto is doing a good job of making decentralization more intuitive.
Yeah, absolutely. Like one of the things that excited me about crypto was when I was a big Reddit user, I was excited by the way it could disseminate weird information quickly, and something obscure could gain attention really quickly from like this sort of crowdsourced effect. But it was too easily controlled and corporatized and heavily moderated and censored and things like that. And I was thinking, in 2014, I didn't know anything about crypto, that, man, it would be great if this was some kind of, if there was a way to do this in a public service style of a way where it could be maintained and not necessarily belong to anyone. And I just had no ideas at the time, but it seems like crypto might afford things like that.
Yeah, I think Web 2 definitely, one of the good things about it is that it just more democratized information in a way, and it democratized the ranking of information. Reddit specifically, it let anyone become a brand and content creator. It let anyone broadcast, and that was a huge deal. I mean, like, we needed to go through that process, and we're still in that process. Like, I don't see actually Web 2 as necessarily like disappearing in this, because obviously as decentralized as possible is ideal, but decentralization is a spectrum, whether or not some people want to admit that. The fact is that human beings, exist in, have relationships with each other. And in order to start an organization, you have centralized groups of people. And so there's not there are ways to design systems to have maximum decentralization, but even in those systems, it's often that it's small groups of people. So I think that we need to reframe how we're approaching centralization, but it's not as if central servers are just going to go away. There will be purposes for using servers for a number of reasons, and you just don't want the core protocol to be dependent on a system that can easily go down, because that puts everybody at risk. But in terms of data processing, data pipelines, research, a lot of the data science tools that exist now, you want servers. You need servers to do a lot of that heavy processing, and for a lot of video stuff. And so most industries will move towards open source and decentralized systems, but I don't think that every system needs to become decentralized.
Just jumping back a little bit, would you agree with my description of Minds, or do you personally see it as something different?
I mean, it's not only for people who have been deplatformed. I mean, there's less than 1% of the people on the network have been deplatformed. So, we're happy to be a place where, if you got kicked off of Facebook for some BS reason, that, you still have a place where you can communicate. And ultimately, we do, we have a whole kind of de-radicalization through free speech initiative that we're working on. Because if you look at the actual research around censorship, it almost invariably shows that censorship causes more violence, extremism, and polarization than not. Even though big tech sites are all saying that they're making the internet safer, they're actually making it more dangerous by doing what they're doing. So it's a very important core tenet that free speech is foundational to the functioning of any kind of healthy society or community or network. But I also think people should have maximum control over what they're seeing, and so it's a part of it. I think that it's a hard thing to define in a few words what we are. I think that
there's no brevity requirement. I would love to delve deep into the philosophy that you've been building.
Ultimately, we're Minds. I want the network to be a sort of manifestation of what the minds on the network want it to be. So, by being open source, like ultimately it's like a community evolving network, and we want to be more of a people powered network where, I think the direction that goes is, going to stick to the principles, but I also think that it should be open. And I don't, long term. I mean, there are a bunch of forks of mines out there. There's a lot of people working on it, building their own versions. And so, yeah, I don't know. I'll kind of get anxiety if I get too much into the semantics and the language of it, because we've had so many long debates, as I'm sure you guys have had, with like identity, brand identity, and like, what are we? What's the different slogans and whatnot. I mean, ultimately, we're an open source social network, and beyond that, there's lots of stuff that you can do. You can earn crypto. You can, you can engage in civil discourse. You can protect your privacy. You can, earn revenue share. You can connect with people that are like you. You can connect with people who are totally different from you. And we are also working on like a more fully decentralized version. We've started building on Ceramic, which I don't know if you guys are familiar with them. Sort of like a mutable layer on IPFS, and it's really interesting. And so we do kind of see, we want to have more of like a pure Web3 app, and then, but again, Web2 is really useful for a lot of people who know nothing about crypto and like don't have any idea what a Web3 wallet is, and how to kind of interface with that world. So it's good to have like an onboarding mechanism. And if we want crypto to go mainstream, like we really do need to be thinking about that. Like, Web2 typically has great user experience. So I think that Web3 needs to remember those design principles. And, the hurdle, the wallet hurdle is, I think it's necessary, and it's a learning curve that most people are gonna have to figure out whether they want to or not. But there's still a lot of work to be done. I mean, specifically with like mobile, because the world is very much mobile now, but like we're talking about Web3. And I think that there's a lot of, I don't know, have you guys run into any of the issues with like the wallet deep linking on mobile? Do you have a mobile app?
We don't have a mobile app. We just have a mobile version of the web app that you can access through a mobile web browser. But mobile is like a super layer on top of UX, because it has a whole different set of constraints. And UX in crypto, as you're saying right now, is already one of the biggest challenges and hurdles. So we're kind of at the mercy of the entire industry's progress on that.
Yeah. Getting the wallet connect to deep link on, even if you're running from a web app and then it's having to grab your mobile wallet, like, these are the kinds of existential things that crypto needs to figure out. I know the Wallet Connect team is working really hard on improving that, but I think the whole ecosystem should contribute to, making that improve, because it really is this kind of like common tool that many projects are adopting, and it's really foundational to like everything functioning.
Yeah, it also seems possible that NFTs are onboarding so many people into Web3 directly that by the time the UX of crypto dramatically improves, there will be a lot more people who don't need that improvement in order to function, because they'll already be familiar with Web3 wallets, especially given that like Brave browser, for example, is sort of building their own version of MetaMask like directly into Brave. And I think we'll see more solutions like that, where the wallet and the browser, like the line between the two, kind of begins to blur or even disappear. So while Ideamarket's UX in particular is probably at the worst condition it's ever going to be, the good news is it's in the worst condition it's ever going to be, because there's all these, all these efforts being made in the right direction and the demographics are shifting. Like the amount of people who own NFTs and are going to in the next year is just mind-boggling, given all the sports partnerships that NFTs are doing. Like it wouldn't surprise me if Rainbow Wallet or Argent becomes the next Chrome browser just by the sheer demand there's going to be for those things.
Mm, right. And yeah, I've noticed kind of the browser within MetaMask recently. So yeah, that does make a lot of sense that actually the wallet will become the browser, and that we might see wallets kind of get more into the browser space from wallet first, and Brave's going like browser first and pulling, and obviously Brave's doing amazing things. Love Brave. But yeah, that would be really cool to see some wallets get more into the browser space. And I agree with you. Yeah, people are getting through the hurdle regardless of how difficult it is. And that really just shows how powerful freedom is. Though a lot of people in the NFT space, I don't think really know that what they're doing is giving them freedom. But that's a good thing too. Like when freedom becomes just a background process, that's where we need to be.
Yeah, you need like the sugar to make the medicine go down. Like you have to find a way to make it fun and quirky, and that's like the really exciting, weird, magical alchemy that happens with like the silliest things are like the sugar coating on the biggest pills. Like Dogecoin and crazy NFTs and stuff are all bringing people into what's really this sort of techno futurist, hopefully solar punk kind of movement through things that from the outside appear to just be nonsense or absurd or expressions of sheer existential angst. Like, I'm just going to buy Dogecoin because it's the stupidest thing I can possibly do. And that's, performance art in some way,
Yeah, I saw one of the Gitcoin founders posted a good meme the other day about the kind of two paths, and it was like Morpheus with two pills. The green pill was the solar punk future, and might have been the black pill. I forget what the other pill color was. They weren't the same colors as blue and red, but the other one was more like dystopian kind of casino get rich crypto. And then green pill was like public goods, open source. And so it is true that some meme coins and whatnot do guide people into freedom, but not necessarily. Some of them can bring you kind of in the door, but then take you down the wrong next door. And that people really need to be aware of that. It's like every crypto isn't like, it may have, it may be a token that you own and control and have to have a wallet and like it teaches you about public and private keys, but it's not a healthy project that is fair for the people. And I think it's, that education needs to keep happening. So just because it's crypto doesn't mean it's good, but there, I think, is kind of a core technological benefit of crypto in general. So it's a little bit of both.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I mean, like the challenging part of freedom is that it gives you the freedom to harm yourself. And crypto, might just be increasing the iteration rate of learning. Like you can more easily become free in a certain way, but you can more easily get spanked by reality in another way. So maybe that's the cycle, that it's that the freedom includes kind of both forks of the path. I think that's a good connection to make.
So one thing that's interesting to me, I mean, considering Minds has now been around, what is it, 6 years?
Yeah.
Yeah. So 6 years in this space is, I think for it's quite a long time really, because this, the space is pretty new in terms of its, at least being well known. I mean, 2015 really would have been when it started to take off, in 2017 with that first huge sort of surge in interest due to, the rise in Bitcoin price and Ethereum price. But in one thing I guess I'd like to ask is there anything now that you've had to deal with Minds which you just never foresaw in the beginning? Like it's entered into a space that you just never saw this coming.
I would say that I didn't realize initially, being more focused on the open source concept, that I would ultimately be kind of fighting for the freedom of, a small subset of like kind of volatile people. Because, with free speech, you end up like it is the core principle to defend the free speech of people whose ideas you oppose. And if you aren't willing to do that, then you really don't care about free speech. And those people are fully capable of evolving their opinions. So if you don't give them a platform to speak their minds, then there isn't quite literally no possible way that they can change their minds. So, the coming from a place of compassion is the only way to actually engage in global discourse. And if you want people to change, then you have to be willing to talk to them. And if you're not, then you don't really care about change. You just care about changing your own little house. But you're just, and that's metaphorically what I think big tech is doing. They're sort of just they're pushing the problem out of their house and just, making it someone else's problem. So, and those people are guaranteed just get reinforced in their bad ideas. So I wasn't expecting to necessarily be defending people that I personally disagree with so much, but it's a very satisfying experience to go through. Frustrating at times, but yeah, getting to that place where, you feel total confidence in what you're doing, even if, it's the media is not necessarily, some of the media is starting to be more friendly to this idea because it's really like an undeniable idea, even in terms of the data around the issue. But, when you have to defend people who you don't agree with, it's not easy all the time, especially when people attack you for doing that.
That's awesome. Are there any particular stories or cases you'd be willing to share?
Yeah, sure. Well, we all know that the media is just brutally polarized, and that some media understands free speech and other media have chosen to forget about it. And so, yeah, I've definitely, like, the vast majority of the media coverage of us actually has, and we've done we've put a lot of effort into communicating with all the different sides of the media and explaining our thesis and how, we're not just kind of having a free for all with no point to it. Like, we actually do believe that dialogue will improve over time when it's in a free speech environment. But like, I had one interview with Vice probably 3 years ago. And I talked to them for like 2 hours, and they were so, nice on the phone and hearing me out. I explained to them about our partnership with Daryl Davis, who's has a famous TED Talk and has done heroic work around de-radicalization. He is a black man who convinced over 200 members of the KKK to leave the KKK. And he did that by befriending them. And he's an advisor at Minds. And he runs his whole podcast at Minds, at minds.com/change. And I explained them the whole philosophy, a lot of the research, and they just ended up writing this hit piece that was so disingenuous and manipulative and really just agenda-based, not wanting to actually understand that, oh yeah, maybe there would be value in seeing the impact of a more open community on dialogue over time. And that, yeah, actually culturally, that would be important data for us to have so that we can confirm that, people can change their minds. But no, they just kind of wanted to focus on like the 3 accounts that they decided to go and find and deem to be problematic. And, that's happened a couple times, and it's but you just kind of got to go with the punches. Like no one's going to agree with you all the time. And if you're always going to have haters no matter what. And actually, if you don't, it might even be a bad sign.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I definitely want to hear more about this whole arm of Minds' work. Can you explain the change program perhaps in some more detail?
Yeah. So, we partnered with Daryl and also Parallel Networks, which is a counterterrorism group founded by Jesse Morton, who's a former Al Qaeda recruiter who changed, kind of became enlightened to his brainwashing, and now he dedicates his life to dialogue and combating extremism. And so we have a paper that we're going to be releasing probably early in Q1 that we also worked with Allen Analytics and Dr. Justin Lane and a number of other PhDs on just bringing all the research that exists around the correlation between censorship and violence and extremism into one place. So that, because, there's just no place that you can really go and see all of this and understand the argument. So we really wanted to create sort of an anthology for people because, defending free speech isn't easy. And it's really nice if you have a massive body of evidence behind, rather than just saying free speech, it's like free speech with data. It's a much more powerful argument. So that's why we've gone into it. And, we're also working on these jury systems for more community curation, moderation, which, overlaps honestly a fair amount with what you guys are up to. And ultimately we want to see over the, decade, haven't decided the exact time frame for the study, but, users who volunteer, we want to understand how people's minds change in all different areas, not necessarily just, actual like extremists on the left and the right, but, anybody whose mind changes about anything, whether some political issue, some, pineapple pizza, like, I don't care. Like, how does the mind change? And how many people are willing to change their minds when they, get into dialogue with other people? Now, you have to be careful because actually Sam Harris did a neurological study about this, and there is something called the backfire effect, which is when you try to convince somebody of something, that is actually the moment that they shut down and don't want to be convinced, and it can actually make them less likely to change their mind when you try to change their mind. And Daryl actually reflects this. He says that when he would sit down with like a KKK member, he would not try to change their mind. He would just sit there and listen to them for, in some cases, even years. And then finally, after they've spouted off for long enough, they'll eventually ask him a question. So there's like this deep psychology at work with creating the breeding grounds for change to happen. And you can't just like think, oh, we're going to go and find all of the crazy people and make them not crazy and force them to not be crazy. This isn't like a insane asylum. These are human beings and they have brains that are just as allergic to being told what to do as everybody else. So I don't know the answer, to be honest, but what I do know is that you can't change someone's mind if you can't talk to them.
100%. And this is just one of my favorite topics of all time. How do minds change? And man, we could go in a million directions with this. I just want to hear more.
There have been some really interesting studies. Specifically, there was one. There's this idea of the toothpaste tube effect, where there was this study done on Tumblr, where it was analyzing pro anorexia content, which that exists, I guess.
Sure.
And as all the crazy stuff that exists, but just showing that when you try to stamp it out, it just pops up somewhere else, and it can really hurt these people when you try to stamp it out. Also, there was a huge study done on Reddit where they analyzed like hundreds of millions of posts, and they were kind of analyzing the efficacy of Reddit censorship, because Reddit actually has become pretty pro censorship in the last number of years, even though they originally weren't. And actually, this is a good story related to Vice. So Vice did a piece on that study, and it was they titled it something ridiculous like Reddit study proves censorship works. It was some ridiculous title like that. But if you actually read the study, it says that I think even in the abstract, that quite clearly these accounts just went to other, darker forums on the internet. So, when you say censorship works, what are you actually saying? Like, okay, yeah, if you ban the Trump subreddit, did you get rid of that? I mean, yeah, you got rid of it. You censored it. So if that's what you're defining as working, okay, that's one definition of working. But it definitely made all of those Trump supporters think that Reddit is completely insane, and for good reason. So the study didn't say that it worked. It said that they just went somewhere else, which is how networks happen. I mean, it's whack-a-mole. This is like network topology. You've got, the internet is a network of networks. So that's just the manipulation that's happening. And, also if you look at like the Chappelle special that got, where there was all this controversy around it recently, basically there were a lot of articles that were saying that Dave Chappelle, his special is like causing real world harm. And, these are the word games that they play. There may have been some studies that show that there can be kind of emotional discomfort or even damage from experiencing negative content. Okay, no one's denying that that content can affect your brain, but conflating emotional discomfort or stress with real world harm that's a big leap. You're going from a altered mental state to something that will then get conflated with violence. So real world harm, and then other outlets will take real world harm and say violence. So, but there's no evidence of that. And actually, if you watch the Dave Chappelle special, the whole thing was about his trans friend who opened up for him at his comedy show and who eventually committed suicide. Most of the people who were, I'm not going to say I agree with everything he said in the special, but it was about his trans friend. So most people didn't even watch it, and they just assumed that he was doing what the media was telling them. So I think that busting this myth about the correlation between censorship and violence and making the world a better place through censorship, I mean, that just needs to be busted. And it's getting busted. I think that most people don't fall for it, but there's also a huge group of people who are still falling for it. So,
yeah, absolutely. And especially when status is put behind it and it's made to look like the sanctioned opinion that we should keep people away from things, that we should shut certain people up, that there's, that some group of people does have the right to assert itself as the adults in the room and to make the kids be quiet, sit at another table. Um, the New York Times does this a lot. Have you seen the official Ideamarket T-shirt? It's got a New York Times article that says, "Don't go down the rabbit hole." It's discouraging people. It says, "Critical thinking as we're taught to do it isn't helping in the fight against misinformation." That's the subtitle. And our official T-shirt is our logo just slicing through this article. I regret that I'm not wearing it right now. But yeah, if just looking at basic psychology and the evolution of psychology, when Freud was studying it, he came to psychoanalysis through hypnosis. He would use hypnosis, and his teacher, his mentor, would use hypnosis to cure hysteria, which at the time referred to traumas being like repressed into a body part. Like, so there'd be a guy who just couldn't move his arm. There was nothing physically wrong with it, but he had some kind of issue that he would like bioenergetically keep over here, and for no physiological reason have no access to his arm. And Freud would hypnotize him and say, "Okay, you can move your arm now." And then he could move his arm, but then something else would be paralyzed because the underlying like psychological trapped energy like wouldn't have an outlet still. It doesn't solve it. And that's kind of like what repression does, what suppression of information does. That on a very basic psychological level, ideas and beliefs just don't respond like physical objects. If you bury it, it doesn't stay down. It finds another outlet. Um, and I just want to underline that point because it's kind of a universal and universally observable law. Bombing terrorists makes more terrorists. And the more obvious and widespread this knowledge is, the more clearly we can see the huge and absurd gap between what the knowledge authorities say they're doing or think they're doing and the effects that they create. Because that gap is just absurd. It's just super weird. If they're interested in the outcome, then they should be more reasonable about it and take the actions that actually create that outcome.
Yeah, and I think that most people and companies would agree with a statement like access to information is a net benefit for humanity. And, that's just obvious from what the internet has done itself, but even, printing press, whatever kind of revolutionary media technology you want to talk about. And so people will agree with that, but then they won't agree with, declassifying all of the government secrets that everybody wants access to. They won't agree with, like, for instance, Google, Facebook, Twitter, they all have different versions of their sites in many different countries. They're called interstitials. And so like there's a different Twitter in Pakistan than there is in the US. And it's kind of based on they have different content policies for all of these countries too. And it's super hypocritical because a lot of them will say, "Oh no, we would never, bow to China. We would never, censor Google for China." But they censor it for Pakistan. And it's basically very similar censorship. So it's like they know that access to information matters and that it's probably one of the most revolutionary forces you could unleash on any authoritarian country to have them change. But they'll still play that game. And so, open source is really about access to information as well. And so, I'm just hopeful that as technology evolves, we just get access to more and more information. And it's sort of, regardless of if the financial system wants to be more transparent with the world or like various central banks, like the beauty of Bitcoin is that it's just going parallel and it's just doing it regardless of if the central banks are going to change. And so there comes a point where you just have to hop over the legacy system and just start building the new system where there is actual access to information and it's a fair system. And I keep thinking about this recently. I think I've started to see some other comments popping up about it, but it's so beautiful to me that Bitcoin and Ethereum and others attract both sides of the political spectrum. I mean, because Bitcoin is and Ethereum, like there's a lot of people like kind of pro-socialism who like Ethereum, but obviously like all the anarcho-libertarians love it as well. That means that something is going right. When you can attract the opposite polarities, people who would never want anything to do with each other, but they both see kind of the fair, sound economic policies that are at work and, how the governance is happening, that it honestly gives me hope. Like, and I think people need to talk about that more because, when communists and capitalists agree on something, it's like, okay, let's focus on that.
Absolutely. Could not agree more. And that's a really exciting aspect of crypto. And something that I've observed recently is crypto is giving people of each demographic a new language to relate to the other. Like the ideas of communism or socialism and capitalism under those names have been so polluted with political weight and like identity group weight that it's really kind of costly and shameful for people to be showing each other lenience on those things across those aisles. But crypto has given people this new language for talking about those things where it becomes permissible to talk about them. For example, you see lifetime venture capitalists, top A-list VCs who are just the very incarnation of capitalism, right? Talking about the merits of social ownership and how that's the future, inevitably. And if you go to Wikipedia and you look at socialism, in the first paragraph it says, well, there's a lot of kinds of socialism, but what they all have in common is social ownership of the means of production. And so they're literally talking about these things just couched in a different kind of a framework. And yeah, you're right. That's an incredibly optimistic development in my opinion as well.
And also understand that, community ownership, individual ownership is what is inevitably going to be the most viral. I mean, that's what the users want. And if you care about the users and if you care about the growth moving into, the 2020s, like there's no choice. I mean, if you don't do that, then you are going to become more and more irrelevant and despised by the users. Because now that these options exist, I love that. It's like, because regardless of, it'd be better if I think some of the VCs get it and are, get it from like a real honest place. Others are kind of getting dragged into, they're like, oh, okay, I guess this is the, but whatever path it is better, because we need the legacy systems to transform. We want them. We don't want just like a schism between, all of the legacy systems and the new system, because, that's polarized. We want the legacy systems to change as well. So, and I think that they will, because ultimately there are humans in there who get it. And, you can even just see it with all of the politicians that are becoming friendly to crypto. It's not, there's not really a debate even. It's more so just once you get it, you get it. It's like, it's just information. I mean, it's data that isn't really like, when you compare Bitcoin with the Fed, I mean, all of the smartest people in the world are figuring it out, and it's becoming like, there are very few really, really smart people that I can even find. I try to go and find them so that I can like steelman their argument and understand like all of the best arguments against crypto. But I mean, can you even find anybody? Like, do you know of who do you think is the most compelling anti-Bitcoin, anti-crypto voice?
I've not been trying to find these, but I would be interested to know what Michael Burry's argument is because he seems to have soured on Bitcoin and crypto recently, and he's, the big short guy. He's famous for predicting the long shots. So while I have no idea what his argument is, and I'm definitely not an expert on the anti-crypto arguments, I'd be interested to see why a man of his sort of character orientation is so anti-crypto, especially this late in the game.
Yeah, I've seen some of those articles, and I would also like to dive in. Let's do that. Let's follow up on that because, yeah, you would think with his kind of ability to just analyze data that he would. I mean, he has total access to everything he needs to understand what the market is doing. There was one debate with this gold bug guy that I would have to. I think he might have been debating Michael Saylor.
Is it Peter Schiff? He's kind of the famous.
Peter Schiff. He's sort of like
Okay.
I don't even know if he's being serious anymore.
I agree. Yeah, I don't want to go down on that tangent.
Yeah.
One thing I'd say about the anti-Bitcoin sentiment, I mean, I'm the same. I haven't really seen too many people, and I don't really go looking for it. But the one writer who I would mention in this regard is Dmitry Orlov, who's written 5 Stages of Collapse and is one of the more intelligent people who's talking about the collapse of society. But he's not like some collapsitarian who thinks it's all going to suddenly smash down. He's more of a patchwork collapse in that some places will be doing quite well and most places won't. But his argument against Bitcoin is in relation to energy and energy uses, and he admits that, well, okay, the energy expenditure in certain places with regards to Bitcoin is pretty bad, or certain cryptos is pretty bad, but that isn't to say that the technology that we're using and the means that we're using within the technology couldn't be utilized in better fashion. So I think the arguments against Bitcoin have to come from a different foundation. Right? You literally have to see the world differently first. And then, because if you're just seeing it as it basically is, I don't want to say like we're all seeing objective reality or anything, but if you're seeing it as it is, then I think you sort of just have to have your head in the sand to find a way to ignore it, right? Like there's not too much against it. The only argument I think that's somewhat plausible is the energy usage one, right? Which is why isn't it about to be banned in Netherlands?
I mean, I read a bunch of Nick Carter's pieces on it, and I just feel like my obvious reaction is, okay, Bitcoin uses a lot of energy, fine, but doesn't the financial legacy system have like thousands of bank branches? Like what's the footprint of banks all over the world? I mean, there's like 10 in every town. So that seems like a pretty big physical carbon footprint. And I think Nick addresses that a fair amount, but yeah.
I love the fact like there's so many banks in every town and they are so not needed, right? It's like this could have been digitized and put entirely online 10 years ago if you were up to date, 5 years ago if you did it, right? They are struggling, like, oh, you have to come to the bank to cash your check because the machine can do it. And they finally admitted that phones can do that. And like the reasons to go to a bank now are basically they have to make them up. Otherwise they realize the whole thing's sort of over. And then once everything's online, if you're online all the time, you might start thinking, well, hang on, I'm going to start looking for other alternatives, right? Because your interest rate basically hasn't kept up with the rate of inflation for 30 years now. So I'm off. So they got to keep you there somehow.
I don't think that I think that they'll probably let go of the physical bank branches in the not too distant future. I think, or at least there will be far less of them. I don't know. I mean, even just with COVID and, the remote work phenomenon, I feel like that would have already convinced them to a certain degree Though I don't think that they ever, banks obviously didn't shut down in the same way that other companies did. But yeah, like every time you walk into a bank, there's no one there and everyone's sitting on their ass, just like twiddling their thumbs.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it makes me wonder. I definitely think and agree that the energy argument against Bitcoin is kind of a red herring because the question isn't how much energy is it costing. It's what are you getting for that cost? It's kind of like saying, is this hair dryer expensive? Well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Is it really good? I guess that's a question that matters to me in particular, even though I don't use hair dryers. But the one of my favorite takes on Bitcoin's energy expenditure comes from Balaji Srinivasan, and he says that the energy expenditure of Bitcoin is the nonviolent defense budget of a global currency. It's not only that we're comparing Bitcoin to the banks and all the real estate that they occupy and office buildings that they illuminate and all the cars of the employees that they make drive to those office buildings every day. It's that it's also competing with the militaries that have to establish dominance for the dollar or whatever fiat currencies are being enforced in anywhere. So you have to evaluate Bitcoin not on its cost, but also on its benefits. And that's the disingenuous part of that argument.
Yeah, and that really tricks a lot of people. I have a bunch of family and friends who I'm sure I'll get a little bit of it this Thanksgiving, who are just, they think that, it's really kind of scary when people take these, they feel like they have morality on their side in some sort of twisted way. Like, people thinking that they're like defending the earth by being against Bitcoin. Or same with people who feel like they're protecting, marginalized communities by censoring content. It's like this moral justification for censorship or, lack of a more open system. But at the end of the day, you gotta go through the debate, and it's just going to play out how it's going to play out.
Yeah, I mean the moral aspect is super interesting because it goes back to the question of how do you change minds, and I think morality is kind of being used to create crusades and create like status hierarchies that anybody can latch onto. If I become a climate person, then I can use climate to bludgeon people about pretty much anything. If I become, any kind of activist, social justice, or whatever, I can use the principles of that to claim moral superiority over anyone. So it just becomes this sort of crusade versus crusade kind of battle royale, using morality as the backbone of all of it. And this has been. There's a long tradition of this, that the way you get people to do bad things is you let them find a way for them to justify it and make it into a good thing. Aldous Huxley in particular wrote about it, saying that the height of psychological luxury is being able to do bad things with a good conscience and like for a good cause. And this sort of co-opting of morality is making it a lot harder to change people's minds because they're investing so much in these moral frameworks that might even be used against them or used against progress, used to prevent people from understanding Bitcoin.
That's a great quote. I love Huxley. He's my fave by far.
Yeah,
such an animal. Yeah, and I mean Thanksgiving coming along, it's like I've sort of we made a post the other day, just be the peacemaker at Thanksgiving. Letting yourself fall into one of the teams is just destined for failure. So I typically am trying not even to. I don't know. It's sad because you want to participate in the debate and you want to say what you feel, but then that's why I feel like steel manning is such an important tool is like, even if you're arguing a position, in that debate, when you steelman someone else's argument, the person that you're debating, it has the effect of not only strengthening your argument because you're finding the best versions of their argument, but they actually respect you because you're playing fair, and you're not only are you playing fair, you're going out of your way to give them a good faith characterization. And I'm really interested in kind of building these types of ideas into the UX of minds, because I just think people experience social media sometimes and they see stuff and they see things they disagree with, and they're just so used to reacting and getting triggered and like, dunking on somebody else. And fine, that's funny sometimes and it's necessary, but if you could just as easily reframe the whole experience and say, hey, actually, the point of being here is to find stuff that you disagree with and engage it in a productive way. And so, when one moment somebody was seeing a piece of content that triggered them and thought that they were getting emotionally abused, the next moment, because they've reframed their experience, they're actually thinking about the human being on the other side of the keyboard. And, they're curious why that person thinks this awful thing. And they're not allowing it to affect their own state of being. And that's just like a useful tool, even offline, to not let, what is that? That's like one of the 4 agreements, which is, just don't take things personally. And it really is just, it's hard. And I don't think any of us are fully capable of doing it. But, bringing that to the internet, I think we have to do it because things are getting so insane and everybody's just so trigger happy every day.
Yeah, I think that's an amazingly pertinent question. Like anytime you're confronted with something you don't understand or a viewpoint that seems absurd, why does this person think X? I think that's a really exciting question. I'm wondering, it sounds also like steel manning might be part of the change program with Daryl Davis's strategy of talking to the KKK members and listening to them. Is that kind of like a micro strategy? Does that tie in?
I think so. Yeah, I think that whether or not Daryl is aware of the term, I think that that's sort of naturally what he has found works just on a human to human level.
Yeah.
When you hear somebody out, the best listener in the room is like usually one of the most liked persons in the room. So,
yeah.
I don't know if he would like how deep he was going and like understanding all of the details of white nationalism, and like trying to act interested in it, or specifically make good versions of their argument. But I think that he for sure like tried to see where they were coming from.
Yeah, absolutely. That's kind of baked into what we're doing as well with Ideamarket. Just the fact that so many people feel unheard and unlistened to. I'm testing the hypothesis that having the ability to make money by listening to things that might seem outrageous can change the incentives of that. Make it less about am I a conspiracy theorist or not, and more about is there value here or not. And I'm really looking forward to seeing to what extent listening can be sort of institutionalized or given infrastructure so that it's not something that could be taken away by media corporations and the social atmosphere at large. Does that make sense?
That'll really change the game if more people can start finding value in the things that they disagree with, even, approaching it from like an academic place. Because like whatever conspiracy theory it is, I mean, obviously there's some conspiracy theories which are completely insane, but they're coming from a certain place. And with any contentious issue, you have data on both sides. And hopefully this is something that we can work on together, is, identifying and visualizing for users the sentiment on both sides, so that if you're looking at, a post about XYZ conspiracy theory or political issue or whatever it is, that it's not the network just telling you, this is true or false. You have a probability score on both sides, and there can be like different references on both sides, which are contributing to why people think something on both sides. But like when I'm scrolling through my newsfeed and I see something that, like I think CIA killed JFK was like trending yesterday, and because I think there was, for some reason some files didn't get declassified, so everybody's talking about that. You just want to see a little kind of visualization of what's happening. And, if you're being told something is true or false, then that's just not helping me learn. I don't know why you're telling me that. I want to see why, and I want to see the arguments on both sides. If you're not showing the arguments on both sides, then you're hiding information from people to make decisions for themselves. You shouldn't, if the evidence is so overwhelming in favor of something being false, then when you did have that visualization, it would be like, 98% of people think this way and for all of these reasons. And it's pretty much as good as a false, but it's different because it's not actually, there's still that 2%. And that 2%, the fringe is, there may be cases which would be very rare, but where the fringe is right. And where, because, typically in social evolution and technological evolution, the fringe is they're the ones coming up with the crazy ideas, which are, were completely impossible. So we know from like time after time historically that you have to look at the fringe. And yes, the fringe is like 99% nonsense, but it's 1% literally the most revolutionary ideas that exist. So you can't, and this is the damage that the censorship is causing too, because when you might be getting rid of like a lot of toxic stuff, but you're also getting rid of, there's collateral damage in there, which, you might be losing access to some of the best ideas that humanity has ever known. So that's really scary. And so unfortunately, we kind of just have to grow up a little bit and be able to deal with some more of the toxic stuff in order to be able to get access to those little, nuggets.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. Like I'm reminded a little bit of the judicial notion in America that it's in theory, people say it's better to let 10 guilty go free than to imprison or kill one innocent. And this principle seems to apply at least this much to information and to ideas, because it's one thing to silence a bunch of conspiracy theorists or some kind of a mob. It's another to, in silencing that mob, prevent a new cure for cancer from arising for an additional 100 years or something like that. And just that we don't know the costs we pay for keeping the fringe on the fringe. And I think they're astronomical. I think the amount of value that can be unlocked just by better accessing what someone on Earth already knows is really really impossible to imagine.
For sure. Good stuff.
Mike, I was just going to ask: are we discussing the thing that's coming up?
Oh, sure, by all means, yeah.
Cool. Well, okay. Well, I think Mike, if you introduce it, and then Bill, perhaps why how you see Idea Market working sort of synthetically with Minds to bolster both visions.
So we were introduced by our friend Grit Cult, and I've been aware of Minds for a long time and seen the sort of philosophical alignment, and I didn't get until recently just how deep that goes with the question, how do minds change from this conversation has just been so foundational, I believe, to both of the work that we're each doing. And we built Idea Market to be this kind of Lego, this kind of universal access port into market curation for social media platforms. And so I'm really gratified that you, Bill, and the Minds Network may see value in using Idea Market for that kind of a purpose. And I'm really excited to test some of the hypotheses that it seems like we share.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been pretty cool to experience, the chaos of open networks, and you watch, especially because we incentivize users with tokens, and we have this whole reward system which people find a lot of value in. You can earn tokens for your contributions and promote content with them. And but the reality is that with that comes some manipulation. And so, creating Sybil resistance and building feeds based on markets, and people, like I mentioned in the beginning, voting with their dollars, I think is just, it's sort of obvious. I'm not going to say that there's not potential risks of that as well, but when you compare them to other risks, I think there's always going to be risks in any path you take. In free systems, there are risks. In very regulated systems, there are risks, and you got to pick which you're going to go with and which has the greater net benefit. So obviously, community curation is the future, open algorithms. So yeah, I mean, it seems like a really obvious relationship to pursue, and we're really interesting to apply it to some of our feeds and see what happens.
Yeah, I'm really excited about the algorithmic applications, which I had not begun to think about. Um, we're just creating price signals, and if you do kind of algorithmic curation with that, then it derives even more of the flywheel of attention being a bet of where people put their money, there so goes attention as well. And by kind of tightening this relationship, we can give people more control over what the public sees and pays attention to and values. Because just so much of the challenge that we face right now is the centralization of the idea of legitimacy, of what deserves to be seen. And if we allow the public to express that in a way that's difficult to fake, I'm really excited to see what kinds of valuable information that would turn up from the fringe as well as anywhere else.
Yeah, I'm curious, how you have seen it work so far, with Twitter, where, I mean, are you seeing, do you feel like it is mirroring your initial hypothesis?
So far, the main activity has been people finding ways to long the platform as a whole. They'll buy the things that will blow up if the platform blows up, which is why you have guys like Elon Musk and Joe Rogan at the top. But even having someone like Joe Rogan at the top signals something like um, that the marketplace of ideas or of credibility is having liquidity given to it. That you don't see, like Joe Rogan's audience is about the same size as CNN's or possibly even bigger now, but you don't see Joe Rogan up next to CNN on Wall Street or like included in that cohort because there's not really a level playing field between those two people, even though they're technically in the same business. They're in the trust earning business in a certain respect. They're in the sense making on behalf of the masses business in a certain respect. And so to provide that level playing field is going to continue to get more interesting to get a sense of who people actually trust. Because if we try to figure that out right now, there's not really a decentralized way to see what do people really believe, who do they really trust. Any kinds of questions like that have to be answered by referring to some sort of centralized source. Corporate media, social media, a polling company, a democratic election, which has all kinds of manipulations going on in its periphery and in its infrastructure. So I'm excited to see what kind of transparency crypto and markets can bring to that question. What's the belief and trust landscape actually look like?
Yeah, and I mean, just looking at your rankings so far, it's Professor Plum is the other skeptic. See, it's funny, you've got Michael Burry and Prof Plum 99 as, you know, right up there with Vitalik and Elon, and they're sort of some of the smart skeptics, and that's what you really want to see. You want to see the skeptics, the people who disagree with you that you do respect, because you know that they're at least approaching things from first principles, generally speaking. So I think that, you know, looking at your rankings, it's very much like on the pulse of the zeitgeist, you know, with Snowden and, you know, even AOC and Barstool. Like, you know, these are, for better or worse, like it's like the new mainstream, basically. And no, I mean, not worse. I think that it's for the better. It's like, you know, AOC, regardless of if, you know, how you feel about her politics, at the end of the day, you have to respect her hustle in that she, you know, she won that election through pure hustle. And
Yeah.
she is very good with social media. And, you know, I saw, for like, even recently, do you know Abby Martin?
Name sounds familiar, but I don't think I do. Is she a congressperson?
She's a journalist. She's a journalist. She's been on Rogan a bunch, and she's on Minds. And she confronted AOC at a climate summit recently, and just brought up the fact that, which I didn't realize, that in most climate usage statistics, military is actually not included for like when the big climate summits are happening. They're not including the military, which is just shocking. And actually AOC like completely agreed with her when she was confronted about that. So I think that I would predict that long term AOC will actually be, you know, she's much less establishment than I think people realize. And that, you know, given something like, I would not be surprised, and I don't actually even know that much about her, but like if long term you saw AOC be like bullish on crypto, just because she's coming at everything from, like we were talking about with, you know, the left and the right both becoming attracted to it because of the economics. And I think that she's savvy enough to, you know, maybe not initially understand that, but eventually go for it. And those are the people that I'm really interested in finding and bringing onto Minds, because they're just a little bit more open-minded. And, you know, I forget the quote that I saw recently, but it was a little bit of a sad quote, but I think that there's a lot of truth to it, that, you know, change ultimately happens when the previous generation just dies off.
Yeah, I think it was, I might be wrong, but I think it was Max Planck saying that science progresses one funeral at a time.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think
that's
we
a
can do better.
yeah.
Let's see if we can do
Yeah,
better.
let's see if we can do better. I think that we can maybe bust that a little bit, but unfortunately, some minds, it's not that they can't get changed, but the amount of energy that it would take to change their minds because they're so entrenched, and it would be just an unfeasible amount of energy. But hopefully,
Yeah,
if there can be tools, I would not be surprised if maybe these are tools that we're developing right now are helping people do that. Because if
yeah,
without technology can solve so many problems, why couldn't it help us help our brains become more flexible? And
yeah,
but it's also that
absolutely.
it's changing minds isn't an inherent good thing. I mean, I think, who was it? What's that magician guy who died? Who was the big skeptic? The
Oh, James Randi?
James Randi. Yeah, he had. I think his quote was, "Be open minded, but not too open minded that your brain falls out." And you know that's just true. Like, changing your mind isn't inherently good. I mean, you could change your mind in the wrong direction. But I think that there's like a general layer of openness that you want, and then there's also a layer of firmness that you want. So it's not just like open-minded is better than being closed-minded. Like, you probably want to be closed or more closed to, like murder. I mean, there's a variety of topics, which in everything it has its like nuanced context, but it's not. Yeah. So it's like an underlying principle. It's not that it in itself is a good thing. If everyone's changing their minds and like abandoning their first principles, then that's not the better world.
Yeah, yeah. And I think you're framing it in terms of how much energy does it take to change your mind is really cogent because there is a kind of economics to it. There is a kind of like psychological game theory to it that when you change your mind, you're not only deciding what you believe, but you're changing the context for all your past actions. You're changing the context for all your relationships, for your sense of identity and community. These are costs, and to the extent that these costs become higher, the the kind of bandwidth within you don't have to pay a cost becomes narrower, and so the walls between tribes becomes higher. And I think there's a lot of room just at the metaphor level to change this. If we just kind of switched off of the idea that like the truth is a thing that you can possess like with certainty, and then it becomes your job to enforce it on others. This is like a crusade level epistemology. But if we can change that into a market related epistemology, risk management. What are the costs and benefits of believing this versus that? What if this is true? It's this likely or it's this unlikely. Um, there's a naturalness to that in that we are constantly making bets with our beliefs, um, and they have consequences. And within a market, you have people who have different risk tolerances, and you can let people decide for themselves what their risk tolerances are going to be. Are they going to be James Randi and be kind of maybe moderate to conservative? Or are they going to be super credulous and place 100 crazy bets so that one or two can cure cancer and be amazing? Um, just by changing the metaphor around beliefs, we can help people go, oh, this changing my mind isn't that weird. It's just about pursuing a more accurate map or placing bets that pay off better than they did in the past. And I think some of the evidence we can see for this is in the fact that the respect that Wall Street opposition, that investors with different opinions have for each other is far greater than the respect that like mainstream liberals and conservatives have for each other. It's a very tribal, like, you're the enemy, you're evil, you're stupid, you're trying to destroy America in your free time just for fun kind of attitude between political spectrums. But Wall Street bulls and bears are like, I disagree with you, but you're just trying to make money. And there's a lot more of like a trust across opinion groups because there's this sense that I know you're doing your honest best, and if you're not, you're literally paying for the privilege.
How do you explain to a skeptic that, the idea that, misinformation is, there actually is financial market incentive in creating misinformation?
Sure. So, like you said earlier, that there will always be risks. There will always be benefits to deceiving people to a certain degree. But if we can make the costs higher and the benefits lower, then that will naturally occur less. Because I think the real goal is not to make it impossible to be evil, but to just make it look as absurd as it actually is. An absurd time, like a morally degenerate society, is one in which we look at like good behavior or moral behavior and go, that's absurd. Why would anyone do that when I have all these advantages that I can exploit? But if we can build systems that make doing more beneficial things seem more reasonable, then just kind of naturally people will gravitate more to that than they currently do. And it's not something that has to be forced. It's just about changing the conditions in which people are making these decisions. Does that make sense? It's very
No,
abstract.
absolutely. And I think that there will be transitional periods where, you do see people testing the waters and trying to manipulate the markets, but then like on the longer term basis, it will sort of work itself out, and people will,
Yeah.
even if they do get some kind of short term benefit in, betting on misinformation, then it just won't pan out long term, and so it'll become not worth it. Yeah.
And there's this notion in, I guess it's in depth psychology, where like you get power over a demon when you learn its name. When you know what the thing is that's tormenting you, and you just say, "Oh, you're Beelzebub," then it like disappears in a puff of smoke. Like when you know what the thing is, you have this control over it that you didn't before. You have this power over it that you didn't before. And what I'd argue with markets is it's only making visible and transparent and explicit what's already implicitly happening behind the scenes. You already have financial interests and other kinds of interests, political interests, affecting the priorities of media houses, of knowledge institutions, of educational institutions. All these things are just happening kind of silently and implicitly, and there's these other games that are just happening inevitably. But by giving them a formal structure for those battles to be fought in, where the manipulation and vested interests are right for everyone to see, that gives us more power over these and gives them less mysterious power over us. But just by making the processes explicit, we can make them a lot tamer and put them in a context where we can deal with them instead of having them exert a silent influence over us.
Totally get that.
Um, I just love the question of how do minds change. I'm wondering, um, have you seen a lot of stories on the Minds platform of people engaging with like, I don't know if the de-radicalization program is something that actually takes place within the network, or like how have you seen conversations, change people on Minds through this, free speech approach that other social networks aren't taking?
Yeah, we definitely have some stories of people that who have like, I know that there's one specific like neo-Nazi type guy who came in and has just like completely left and is now just into all kinds of healthy creative expression. And I mean,
Wow.
I don't Yeah, we've done some polls and some surveys, and those are going to be included in the paper that we release. I think that there's also just like a general tone that when people are in an oppressive environment, they behave differently. So like when you're on a big tech app and you just don't respect it, I think that the discourse can kind of devolve. But when you're in a place that you know from the outset like, cares about your expression, it doesn't mean that people change their mind, but I do think that it changes their behavior a little bit in terms of how they express themselves. And so even if they do have some awful views, they're maybe a little bit more respectful. I'm not saying that everybody is respectful. Like that's not a universal truth. But again, it gets back into the backfire effect. It's like when you're on Twitter, there's just sort of this subtle chilling effect and like force that's working against you where you feel a little bit, there's clearly just certain things you're not going to post because you don't know if you're going to get shadow banned. But you just know that there's this ideology there from the top down of the network. And it just makes you behave differently. Like if you're in somebody's house who is an ideologue, like, you're just going to act, you're not going to be yourself. Or you're not going to be a better version of yourself if that's possible. So I think that the environment where the discourse is happening and the tone of it and the mission of it matters a lot for like setting the stage for conversations to happen. And it doesn't mean that it won't get polluted sometimes, but there's a lot. But I wouldn't be surprised if there's other cases of people. The thing is that our numbers are, we've got like 5 million users or something like that, but the pool is not the same sample size as like a big tech app. So, when you have that many people, you would get a much more clear picture of what is actually working. I think that because we are getting some of this fallout from big tech, whether it's for privacy or deplatforming or whatever it is, like, there probably is a higher relative concentration of some of the, whether it's like a conspiracy theory or whatever it is, like maybe a little bit more of the fringe. I think that we definitely have like a lot of people who aren't into that stuff and are just like artists who are trying to get the word out about their work. And they feel like that Minds offers them more of an opportunity than big tech because you just kind of get drowned out over there. But, I don't know. I don't know all the answers. We've definitely had some really cool stories that we've seen. And that's been really reassuring. But that's kind of what the research project is about long term, is like starting to catalog those on a much more systematic and empirical basis.
Yeah, that's awesome. I really like your point about how the environment that the conversation takes place in affects the conversation itself. That's a really subtle thing that I hadn't even heard mentioned before, really. But yeah, like you can kind of see, for example, on Reddit, how every subreddit kind of has its own little government, and you can definitely see the differences in the ones that work well and have interesting discourse and the ones that don't. It's all kind of based on how the moderators set things up and how they enforce rules and guidelines and things like that. There's definitely a better and worse way to host conversations, and so that's really interesting.
I got to hop in a few minutes, guys.
Go ahead. Sure.
Any things you want to wrap up with?
Yeah, I'll ask one more thing. Given the Minds' philosophy and the users that attract that have a lot of the same sort of priorities in terms of free speech and transparency and open discourse and stuff like that. In the spirit of the conversation of it's better to let 10 bad ideas go free than to suppress one good one. Are there any like amazingly good ideas or information or knowledge that you've seen crop up on Minds that might not have gotten traction anywhere else?
Hmm. Um, yeah, for sure. I think that I would definitely point to the art. Um, because art is definitely ideas, but I think that we have this ability for people to amplify their work that just doesn't exist on other social networks. And so, and actually, I object to a lot of what TikTok does, but I think one of the things that TikTok does well, which is kind of similar to this, is it gives random people this ability to go viral based on like how it's surfacing people, as opposed to just celebrities or influencers and whatnot. So I think that I've just discovered so many amazing artists and thinkers and writers and whatnot, but because they had the ability to boost up their content and give it like a chance at gaining traction, I think that there's so much stuff that gets buried on Twitter, for instance, just because there's no tool. I mean, hashtags, but it's really hard to gain viral traction unless you have some sort of tool to help push it up. So I think, it gets into kind of the fringe being like either lost or just forgotten about. But yeah, you need mechanisms that can kind of hunt for those nuggets in the fringe and in like people who have no followers, because sometimes I just wonder, and there's no evidence for this, but how many great ideas throughout time just died, that like discoveries that we just never knew about. Like there could be some total, it's almost like, if from a probability perspective, I would say it's almost impossible that there aren't breakthrough ideas that humanity has come to and lost, which is like exciting and terrifying at the same time. So, and I think that's actually a huge argument in the favor that I think people would be able to recognize about why the fringe is important and why we have to sort of protect it. Because regardless of if, and it gets back to the same philosophy, like, you don't want to falsely put one person in prison. It's like, you don't want to falsely, or you don't want to lose that one good idea, and you want to do what you can to find it. So that seems like an intuitive idea that any normal person could understand because of just the facts of the matter of how the scientific breakthroughs have happened. And or not even necessarily a scientific breakthrough, but just like a great idea that changed how people think about things. It could be an artistic idea. It doesn't have to be scientific.
Yeah, 100%. Just that the value, I couldn't agree more, that the good ideas are worth so much more than the damage done by bad ideas. That is absolutely like the direction to lean in, like maximizing the good stuff and finding it rather than minimizing the bad stuff, as if we have the ability to judge that well either way.
It's just crazy to me that I feel like this is obvious, and it's just sad almost that I feel like we are on the defensive about about this whole concept. And because there's so much evidence just looking at the US and, other authoritarian countries and, long term, what has produced the most innovation and like how free societies have clearly had an edge. But that's definitely being attacked right now. And so it's really important for us to prove this more on the internet. And, I don't necessarily blame a lot of the skeptics because so big social networks have done such a horrible job of leading this conversation. I mean, they've just buckled every step of the way and they haven't stood up for any of this. Like, when have you ever heard a single big tech executive talking about any like this? I think that this is a really kind of unique conversation that we're having, but at the same time, like for people who read books, this isn't new information. So it's just like, what's your take on why we don't see any like traditional Silicon Valley leaders talking about this?
My first guess would be that it's because centralization is still so endemic that leaders like Jack Dorsey, who I believe would agree with all this, doesn't really have recourse. If governments are pressuring him to suppress misinformation and the governments have the ability to shut down his business, like he doesn't want to do censorship. Users don't want him to do censorship. It's only because the government has no better idea than to force Jack Dorsey to do censorship that he does censorship. And
I wish that I could give him the benefit that it was just governments.
Yeah. Okay.
That would be maybe what he would say. And there's undoubtedly truth to that. I mean, I know that countries are, throwing fines at him and, you're going to get banned from our country, which, our stance on that is like, okay, ban us. I mean, I'm not going to take down content that Pakistan tells me to take down. That's ridiculous.
Yeah.
You think that people in Pakistan will figure out, they can use a VPN or whatever. They'll figure it out. I have faith in them. But I think that it's a little bit deeper in that there are ideological factions within these companies that, and it gets into that kind of whole silence is violence or, speech is violence type mentality where there's powerful people in the companies. Not that I don't know what Dorsey agrees or disagrees with. He hasn't even given us the decency of explaining that he may think differently from how his company thinks, which would be nice if we knew that, at least the debate was happening. But I think that, did you see the thing that just came out? What was the company? But they sent out a notice of like the average donation that was $14.92. And they sent out like an apology note after, because they said, oh, we were being insensitive by saying that the average donation was $14.92 right around the holidays, the Thanksgiving holidays, because of like, Christopher Columbus and the native genocide, which is just, it's like, this is the mentality coming out of, which is inside big tech companies. And it's like, okay, yeah, like obviously there was crazy unethical stuff that happened in, colonialism, but like, that can't infect the company to such a degree that like we're paralyzed from, having this conversation and, but then it impacts the actual content policy of the site, because the content policy of Twitter actually has banned people for stating like, like Megan Murphy, who I was on her podcast the other day, like she got banned for saying, a man is a woman, and, because it was like dead naming or whatever. And like, obviously no one, it's not even getting into a moral judgment. It's just more so like, yeah, we don't want anyone to be mean to each other. Okay. But like, unfortunately, this is the planet Earth and people are mean to each other. And we have to be able to deal with that and understand like long-term speech benefits. So
I think you're totally right. I definitely spoke too soon. Yeah. Along those lines, I couldn't agree more that there seems to be unskillfulness happening in terms of deciding what sort of tides are worth swimming against and which ones are worth incorporating into your framework. Because there are certain human behaviors and fallibilities that are just ineradicable and are going to be around, and you have to plan for them to be around rather than try to suppress them. I think that's
and I think
dead on.
there's ways to be sensitive for marginalized communities that big tech needs to figure out that, you know, doesn't like ignore concerns, but that again, like shows the research and evidence that, you know, that actually that approach, while totally understandable, is not the approach that the data shows works. You know, so, you know, and it's like it's also assuming that marginalized communities like don't want free speech, which I know that there are a number of like public figures emerging, you know, in the trans community and in different other marginalized communities who, you know, don't want to be told that they think a certain way or want or don't want free speech just because they're in that community. So there's this sort of conflation that happens, and I think that's extremely offensive to some people in these communities. That's why it's so exciting to see people like John McWhorter get a column in the New York Times recently. I don't know if you guys know who he is.
No.
But he just wrote a book which was like it made it to the top 10 New York Times. It's called Woke Racism, and he's a black man who you know, it's a very provocative title, but he's very much like in like the Coleman Hughes camp and sort of this, you know, he's not going to fall into the bucket of just being told that he thinks a certain way based on his physical characteristics. And that's just such a powerful force, and it's very uncommon, but it becomes more common when more people are exposed to it. And I think that, again, I think we're going to get there because people, you know, like that in itself is just like a huge progression. And kudos to the New York Times for giving him a column and, you know, standing behind that perspective, because it was controversial. But
Yeah,
that's kind of where I think things need to go. And maybe, you know, McWhorter is, you know, takes it even too far. But, you know, just the title of woke racism is, you know, you could see how that would be immediately triggering to some people. But so it's probably maybe a little bit overly intentionally provocative, but, you know, what are you going to do? I think that, yeah, gaining a tolerance for provocative content is super necessary. And yeah, but cool. I mean, I really appreciate coming on and talking to you guys. This was awesome, and let's keep doing it.
100%.
Thanks, man.
Thanks so much for your time. And yeah, the
Thanks very
Ideamarket Minds Market will go live by December 1st, which is a week from today.
Wow,
By
that's awesome.
Wednesday, December 1st. Yeah.
All right.
So
Hopefully we
we'll
get
do
a
that
sneak peek.
Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday. I'm sorry?
Can we get a sneak peek?
Right now,
No,
there's
not now.
nothing
Not
that
now.
I can share screen on it.
No,
But
let's
by all means, I'll keep you apprised.
yeah, hit me up a few days before, and because I also want to figure out how we can get some integration on our end as well, which would be sort of ideal.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, this was awesome. Mike, James, thanks, guys.
Great pleasure.
Thanks very much,
We'll
Bill.
talk again later.
See ya.